There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Am I ever happy to be here today to review a wonderful novel that I just finished a few days ago called After the Parade by Laurie Ostlund, a 2016 novel from America. And I loved it so much. And I owe a big debt of gratitude to Russell, and I hope he sees this because I often try books that Russell recommends on his channel, and Russell's and my taste, the Venn diagram, there's only a sliver where Russell's taste and my taste overlaps. So I have felt so bad about books that I've tried that I didn't like or bailed on or whatnot. So Russell, this was within that little sliver of our Venn diagram overlap. Thank you so much. I saw him talk about it on a video about a month ago, and by the time I'd finished watching his spiel, I'll put the link in my show notes, I had found out that it was available to me as an ebook on Scribd, and I started reading it within 5 minutes. And I read it very slowly over the month of January and just loved it. After the Parade is the story of a gay man named Aaron, and the narrative baseline is him leaving his long-term relationship with a man a generation older than he is, and he's announced, I think, to Walter that he's leaving, and he leaves with his U-Haul full of all of his belongings and heads for San Francisco. He's never lived alone. He moved in with Walter. Walter, quote-unquote, rescued him from his unhappy childhood in a small town in Minnesota. So he kind of went from that unhappy situation into this 2-decade-long relationship with Walter, and has realized or decided that he's not in love with Walter anymore, and he leaves. So it's kind of a voyage of self-discovery. There's a big dramatic incident on his very first night in a motel where he hears violence happening in the motel room next to him, breaks the door down because the police were taking so long to arrive, and saves this young kid from being, brutally assaulted by his dad. And it's described in such rich detail without kind of being a dramatic thing. Like, this is a very... Russell kept saying over and over again, and I'm going to plagiarize his phrase, it's quietly powerful. But there's this big dramatic incident, and there's a few throughout the novel. But it's not a dramatic novel. It's a very reflective, calm, narrative voice. And so that, with this dramatic incident right off the get-go, I was hooked. This is a really digressive novel. So Aaron is driving to San Francisco, and then he begins to start a new life in San Francisco, and the timeline is the first 6 months after he leaves Walter. But it's an incredibly digressive narrative structure, and we loop back to get more of a sense of his relationship with Walter, and then farther back and farther back. And so it's the classic psychological process, right? When you make a new beginning, chart a new course, or strike out in a new direction in life, things from the past come up with a vengeance. And so he's reliving and remembering and confronting an extremely unhappy childhood. I'm not going to say a lot about his childhood. You need to just read this book. But the one thing, the title, After the Parade, refers to the death of his father. And he was only about 5 years old when his father dies. And his father was an incredibly physically threatening and abusive man towards Aaron's mother and towards him. And we see a lot of that, and it's really heavy stuff. And then, I personally thought it was good news, but his father dies accidentally. He's a policeman, and he's on a float in a parade in this small, rinky-dink little town, and he falls off the back and lands on his head and dies. Well, as a reader, it's easy for me to clap and say, yay, the bad man is dead, but, in life, that's not how things work out. So his mother feels horribly, it's a complicated gift when a bad husband dies, and she just falls apart. Enough said. But it is a very chaotic and rough, emotionally wounding childhood for Aaron. It sounds like he never really dealt with that, in his relationship with Walter, and his relationship had been kind of a way of avoiding that. I'm sure it was other things, but that was one of the negatives. So here he is, striking out single, and he's, I hate that word, but processing all this. But it's written in such wonderfully reflective, extended passages, vivid writing. The prose just flows like water. I will read one scene. This is when his mom really loses it, and this is about just maybe a few weeks after, or a month after the dad has died. And they're in a store, and the mom loses it, and she is taken by, I don't know if it's in a straitjacket, but she's taken by ambulance to the hospital because she has a complete mental breakdown in the shop. So while all the paramedics are rushing and taking care of his mother, he's using pennies that at his father's funeral, all the relatives gave him a penny. And so he carries them around. They're his dead father pennies. And so to calm himself down at in this shop, he buys bubblegum from the bubblegum machine using all his pennies, and that's what's going on here. By the time the ambulance arrived, his pockets were empty, his dead father pennies converted into bubblegum, which had formed a wad in his mouth the size of a ping-pong ball. "What's your name, son?" one of the paramedics asked. Aaron stared up at the man, cheeks puffed out, lips pulled back menacingly. His jaw had gone numb, so he did not know that he was drooling, his spittle tinged green and pink and blue. With his pockets empty, he felt as though he might float away, so he stood very still, watching as they strapped his mother to a gurney and wheeled her to the ambulance, and as the saleswoman ran after them with the cheap dress shoes. She returned looking satisfied, her transaction complete, but she saw him then and stopped. "How can you just stand there chewing gum?" she asked in a cool, steady voice. He stared back at her, feeling the familiar urge to vomit, but he knew nothing could get past the gum. He panicked, the pastel spittle foaming around his mouth as he struggled to breathe. "What kind of a boy are you?" the saleswoman said, just before he passed out. What kind of a boy is Aaron, indeed? What kind of a man is Aaron? And this novel explores that with such a unique, quietly powerful voice, with all these digressions. Everybody seems to love Aaron, and so many weird characters are drawn to him, and this novel makes room for their voices and their stories, so that, again, digression after digression. It really worked for me. But bear in mind, he's 5 years old when, maybe 5 or 6 years old when this happened. And so you have to suspend belief a bit that this third-person narrative is describing his experience, or he's remembering this experience enough. You have to suspend belief a little bit to go with it, and I had no trouble. I originally gave this novel 4 stars, and the suspension of disbelief I thought was a little bit of a flaw, but I didn't care. I still loved the novel, despite that. I thought that this was another example of a novel with a gay male protagonist written by a female author that didn't portray the gay man's sexuality in a way that rang true for me. The Tin Man was another one, but there's been a few over the years where I just think it's really hard to capture that. Controversial, essentialist, sue me. But a little bit. He was kind of a sexless guy, but that didn't knock off any stars for me because, there are gay men like that in the world, right? What did knock a star off for me was this tiny little section. It did carry a lot of narrative weight, but it was probably only about 20 or 30 pages in total in the entire novel. After the dad's death, the mum takes him several hours car drive away to visit her old friend, Gloria. And Gloria is obviously a lesbian and is quite seemingly in love with Aaron's mom. They live on a farm, and Gloria has a brother named Clarence, Clary for short. And I don't think this is going to be a spoiler, but if you don't want any spoilers at all, fast forward a minute or two. This, again, it's kind of a small thing in the story, but Clary, he seems ageless. I have no idea how old he was, but Clary was a dwarf. I had no problem with that. Clary was in a wheelchair. I had no problem with that. But Clary had tusks protruding from his nostrils. And I had a huge problem with that. That was a repulsive image for me. And maybe I should be ashamed to admit it. But hear me out till the end of this, because this was an important part of coming to terms with this book. And I just couldn't understand, why would you do that? What are you trying to do to me as the reader? And I was just so uncomfortable for that chapter or two. And Aaron's 5 years old, and he's meeting Clary and his sister Gloria, and Clary seems weird too. Like, he speaks like, has a really pedantic way of talking. Like, he's very intelligent, but really weird. But it was just this. Why did you do that? Why would you do that to that character? And I just thought, this is kind of, why are you trying to freak me out or freak the reader out, or why are you making this character so freakish? What are you up to? And she lost me. So I don't know what that was about, but that was weird, too weird for me, so 4 stars instead of 5. Today, I have reread that chapter after having had a few days to sit with it. I experienced it as a viscerally powerful set piece within the novel. And I remembered this from the first reading, but it really hit me the second time. Clary asks Aaron, 5-year-old Aaron, if he's scared of him, and he said, yes, I am. And he said, is it because of my tusks? And Aaron didn't really say much, and Clary said, would you like to touch them? And Aaron said, yes. So he reached out and touched these. They're adenoids, right? I think it's a weird thing. I went on the internet. I couldn't find any examples of adenoids protruding from someone's nostrils, but that's what they were. Clary says, their adenoids run amok. Aaron, 5-year-old Aaron, reaches out and touches them and says, they're beautiful. And that didn't hit me as much on the first, because I was too busy being freaked out. But on the second reading, I thought, okay, no, that's why she did it. Because that's a key passage to understanding Aaron's character. He is drawn to odd people, and he finds beauty in so much of what he sees in the world. So you can't help but love him. And I fell in love with him and this book that much more after reading that passage on a second reading. But it did really catch me off guard the first time. And I still would say that there was a bit of a flaw in that those characters seemed really gothic to me, and the rest of the novel was completely realistic. Strange people, but everyday realistic situations and character weirdnesses. But this one, and I'm no longer talking about the tusks, but just they were larger than life in a really weird gothic way, and I thought that was a little bit jarring. But that no longer, now that I've come to terms with the adenoids running amok, that none of that detracts. So, in total, I love this novel so much. I can't wait to read more by her. She's got one collection of short stories already out, and hopefully there's going to be much more from Laurie Ostlund. I recommend it extremely highly to you. Aside from Russell and now myself, there aren't many booktubers that have been talking about this. I hope that will change. Thanks for watching.